We hear a lot of perspectives on the Mankind podcast. Inclusion of a guest is not an endorsement of their views, and the opinions expressed here do not always represent the mission or values of the Mankind Project USA.
Looks like the rain has gone.
Hey everybody, it's Boysen Hodgson with the Mankind Project and the Mankind Podcast. June 1st, happy Pride Month. Welcome. I'm with Daniel Ellenberg today. Daniel's been on here a couple of times. He's been on the podcast a couple of times, but we're going live today for a fairly brief conversation to talk about something that we're both passionate about, which is men and boys and compassion. So, hi, Daniel. Say hello.
Hi, Boysen. Great to be with you.
Briefly about Daniel Ellenberg. PhD is the founder of Strength with Heart men's groups and workshops and a past president of the American Psychological Association's Division on Men and Masculinities, Division 51. Daniel also leads the Men and Boys Compassion Initiative and serves on the advisory boards of the Global Compassion Coalition and the American Psychological Association's Future of Work. And he's a principal at the Rewire Leadership Institute. So we're going to start the conversation from a very simple question. What's compassion?
It may be a simple question, but the answer may not be quite as simple.
Yes.
Right? And so I think a lot of times people mistake empathy for compassion. Empathy is part of compassion, but compassion is more than only empathy. And so empathy, if you look at it, is the experience of being able to feel what it's like to be someone else. Compassion is empathy plus a genuine desire to help alleviate if that person is suffering, their suffering. You can be empathic, so to speak, as a sniper. You know, it's not, empathy can actually help you be a better sociopath, you know, in a certain way. So empathy, although people tend to think it's always such a great thing, it isn't always used toward great ends. Compassion, to some degree, there's no real downside to it.
Because it implies a commitment to helping, it implies a commitment to other in some way.
It implies at least a desire to be helpful. It doesn't always imply that the person's going to do something, but it is at least the beginning of a movement toward helping.
So in our context here, so you've kind of gone empathy and compassion. How about sympathy as another one of those words that often gets lumped in there?
You know, it's interesting how sympathy is to some degree a little bit like compassion, but it doesn't necessarily imply a genuine desire to help. You feel bad about some of it. Sometimes people see sympathy as like pity. And like a lot of guys, when they hear something like, oh, I feel sympathy towards you, they go, well, don't pity me, right? Because that's not exactly a masculine experience of wanting to be pitied. Not that we don't pity ourselves, you know, at times, but it's not generally seen as particularly desirable.
Yes. Yes. Why? So you have been a part of the APA's Division 51, the study of men and masculinities. You have worked with some really big folks around compassion and mindfulness and the Global Compassion Coalition. Why do you think that this is important in our discussion about men and boys and what's going on with masculinity? Yeah.
Right. I think it's the single most important lens to be looking at boys and men and people, you know, in general through. If you take a global look at the planet, I'd say that the primary reason, if there is only one, and there isn't, there are many, many different factors, but if we were to look at probably the primary lens to be seeing through other people, through humanity, through, is one of compassion. Because the reality is it's difficult being human, right? We know on some level that there is not only a beginning, obviously, because we're here, but there's also an end waiting out there. Death is the ultimate vulnerability. In Buddhism, it talks about the heavenly messengers of old age, disease, and death. And there's a way that all of these highlight life. It's impossible to think about life in toto without recognizing that there is an end to that. And we all kind of live with that. That's part of what existential philosophy is about, the awareness that there's an edge between being and non-being. And we could just flip over there. And anytime you're driving, it could be, you just don't know, what's going to happen. You think about people's anxiety these days about even sending their kids to school. Like, oh my God. So there's a level of vulnerability threat that in general people live with that we don't pay enough attention to. And if you think about compassion, compassion is very much related to vulnerability, right? And when you think about vulnerability, that's something that we males tend to learn is not such a good thing, right? So, and on one level, you can look at like, what does vulnerability mean? Right? Literally, the definition is openness to attack. And so when we're telling guys, you should be more vulnerable, right? And that's some of the modern ways of looking at guys these days. Certainly not in every area, but in many. And guys are going, what? Be more vulnerable? No way. I have to gird myself. I have to protect myself. I have to armor myself. Which, as it turns out, in some contexts is true, right? And so it's not that vulnerability or being vulnerable is always a good thing. You don't want to be vulnerable as much as possible to diseases. You don't want to be vulnerable to certain threats. And at the same time, it's also a portal into closer, more intimate relationships. And by intimate, I'm not assuming sexuality. I think of it as intimacy, the phonetic of intimacy. So in order to really feel deeply connected, you actually have to show vulnerabilities. And yet at the same time, learning that somehow that's a bad thing, that it's threatening to do so, that it's going to make you less manly, that there are downsides, people take advantage, of you. When you start juxtaposing all of these different things, it can feel super complex to guys, particularly these days, where it's just, there's a lot of uncertainty. How do I be as a guy? What's a real man? We're getting all kinds of different countering messages. And what's a guy to do? It makes young men vulnerable to guys like Andrew Tate, and some of these characters out there who are really saying, like, this is the way to go. Don't show vulnerabilities. Go back into the dominator mentality. Take what you can get, and screw everyone else, which is not exactly the kind of mindset that's going to help our survivability on this planet. So it's to be actually open, to one's vulnerability and to other people's vulnerability, and to actually care. It actually takes courage to care. So many of us, we feel screwed over as kids. We don't trust. We've had, been abused in different ways and bullied and all kinds of not fun stuff. And so it's like a natural thing to build up armor or defenses. Defenses are natural. And, in life, we want to keep removing those as much as possible in order to have better relationships.
So,
which doesn't mean trusting everyone. Right?
I heard you start that whole explanation, then it circle back to that whole explanation with a global vision, a global perspective. And it seems to me that one of the ways that this is so important, compassion as an operating principle, compassion as a practice, compassion as a value to associate with men and masculinity, is that we get trained to hold a smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller window of those who we will have compassion for as men, right? But then when you start a conversation about compassion, your vision, your perspective immediately went to look at the world right now, which can feel overwhelming, right?
You think?
Yeah, I do. I do
Well,
think.
Yeah.
So this kind of man box conversation that you and I have certainly had before, right? We get trained to have compassion for a very small subset of the human population, those within our distinct, just within our family even, and then armor ourselves against having a broader compassion, a care for helping others.
And indeed, Boyce, and there are psychobiological reasons why, it's a smaller part. I mean, when you think about tribal nature of being human, part of what we've learned from evolutionary psychology is compassion is like an in-group, experience, not an out-group. Look, others are potential threats. So you learn to trust more so the people in your group and distrust the people outside of your group. And we can see that playing out on a global level. It's us against them. There's the old biblical saying, me against my brother, me and my brother against our cousin, me, my brother, and our cousin against the stranger. So it's part of the wiring. And I do believe that wiring, being as it is, indeed can be quite hardwired, but because of being human, we actually can change our brains to be more inclusive. And so when we're looking at part of what we're seeing in the world, diversity, equity, inclusion, that's actually going against a certain grain in human nature. Now, if we lived in a world where there weren't kind of resources that people were grabbing, this is mine, keep away from me, that's yours, keep yourself, in a different area, I don't trust you, you don't trust me, then indeed, we're kind of stuck. Now, because as the world keeps getting bigger and we have bigger weapons and we have greater climate change and we have different health issues, we can't continue this way, and so looking at it globally, I think is really important, but practicing locally is at least as important, because it's one thing to have a concept about, it's great to be compassionate, but the devil's in the details. How do you actually practice that, right? And by the way, compassion doesn't mean agreement, right? It doesn't mean that you agree with what somebody else's values and that you support those. You can actually counter those. You can go be against, on some level, someone's values. Kind of like the whole idea of like hate the sin, but not the sinner, in a way. And I don't even like to use the word hate, but oppose bad behavior that is not necessarily pro-social. But at the same time, be aware of your own internal operating system that goes into hatred. And I know for me personally, I've done a lot of work and continue to about, on some level, metabolizing my hatred. I can go into politics and feel hateful towards certain politicians. Look at certain people and feel hatred. And recognizing that that's a part of the complexity of who I am, just as for each of us as human beings, we have a multitude of different aspects. And what are we attuning to? What are we, on some level, breathing into? What are we trying to transform? What are we accenting? And so there are these choices that come up along the way around how much do I kind of like look at some shadowy part of myself and go, is that how I want to be? What if everyone was like this? Right? And so I do believe that when we come back to the theme of compassion, that is something that weaves together pretty much everything, because you can not like something about somebody else, but also recognize that they're a human being, and that underneath all of that guardedness and defensiveness, there's someone who wants love, someone who wants connection, someone who wants to belong, someone who wants to feel significant and lovable, even if it's hard to see.
And to begin recognizing those characteristics from this place of compassion as an active thing. I am willing to care about you getting those things for yourself, just as I care about getting those things for myself and the people that I love, right? Yeah.
The active part of it is a key element. I think a lot of times people look at compassion as kind of as an emotion, per se, which to some degree it is, but it's actually at least as much of an action, and it's a muscle. you have to exercise that muscle. It's a practice, of compassion, because it's very easy to go into judgment and disqualifying others, including oneself. By the way, because compassion, is often most difficult for a lot of us when it's directed toward ourselves, and that's an awareness that we ourselves are suffering in some way, and we have a genuine desire to help alleviate that suffering rather than criticizing ourselves for having an issue, so to speak, in the first place. Right? And
really good. Self-compassion, and then I circle immediately into, so putting self-compassion and hatred, as you just brought hatred into the conversation, into the same frame as, so what is hatred, right? So like a combination of fear, rejection, denial, and projection often, right? So I often am projecting onto people who I hate for whatever reason. I'm in denial about something about myself. I'm trying to keep myself from feeling some sort of existential pain within me, or owning parts of myself, right? And then back to self-compassion. So what is the active part of me caring for me so that I can see the humanity in someone else, regardless of whether I agree with them or disagree with them?
Right. Well, we dislike in others what we don't want to see in ourselves. Certainly that's part of the nature of shadow. Right. I am the good person. You, not so much. Right. And it's nice to see ourselves in a positive light and others in a negative in a certain way. But oftentimes we tend to also see ourselves in a very negative light. It's very hard to hate humanity but love ourselves. Right? It doesn't work that way because it's all connected in our own mind. And so I think about compassion as really a mindset, having a compassionate mindset, and recognizing that it's not a simple thing. It takes work to be compassionate. I think a lot of times people think about compassion as this kind of, it's a nice concept, but it's kind of weak. Like if you were a real man, you wouldn't need compassion. I would say the opposite. I think that really the more that we're able to feel into others and be relational with them and recognize that we still have our own boundaries. It's not like suddenly you're the other person, but really the courage to care as guys, that's huge. And I think part of the issue is that guys are judged a lot. I mean, these days it's not going well. I mean, you don't have to look very far, to see it's not going well for boys and men. And there are people out there who go, well, screw them, especially white guys, they've had it good for a long time. Now it's time for them to suffer, which is a really a weak orientation in my mind. I think that we need to really lift all of us up and not to just look at only, one sector, people. When we exclude others, we exclude all, on some level. And so you look like when you want to say something.
Yeah, when we exclude others, we exclude all. And you and I were checking in. So June 1st, beginning Pride Month, in the last couple of months, I've been following Alok Maid Venant, who's a transgender speaker, performer, artist, has been, look up Alok and go listen to some podcasts. And they speak really brilliantly to that thing around transgender issues, and that trans folks who step forward to say, I am going to fully love myself and be out here in the world, and how that becomes the trigger for so many, especially for men, especially for heterosexual men, because it's so hard for me to wrap my head around that full of a love. You fully love yourself? Like, how dare you? I have to make you smaller.
Right. But, again, loving oneself does not exclude one from loving others. In fact, it can, if it's truly love, it's not just narcissistic, all about me, But love itself is expansive. Love itself is relational. You can't just truly love yourself without seeing and experiencing yourself as part of humanity, part of something larger. And compassion actually helps us feel part of the human race. So many people just don't feel part of it. The human species, not a race, the human species, right? And not feeling part of is part of the problem. I mean, we have an epidemic of loneliness. People who are in the midst of large crowds are feeling totally alone, right? And it's a grief and a sadness. It's a silent killer, loneliness. It's actually as impactful health-wise as smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. And so compassion helps us connect, and it really takes courage, to let yourself care. And so I think a lot of times people see compassion as this, oh, it's nice, it's soothing somebody, who's in pain, and that's a nice thing to do. And it's seen as actually more feminine, right? And so part of what guys, have challenges with is like, I don't want to be a girl.
Right.
Because part of the traditional masculinity ideology is being anything other than girls. If girls are this way, boys are that way. If girls are caring and kind and nurturing, boys are tough and to some degree uncaring and just organized around winning. And it's just not true. It's just not part of being human, but it's part of our conditioning. And that's part of what we really need to address. And I think one of the things that we are really looking at in the Men and Boys Compassion Initiative, which is a group of people that I'm leading and working with these days, is really looking at, to some degree, even early childhood education. How do teachers relate to boys? And it turns out that there are a lot of judgments, toward boys. They shouldn't be that. They should be sitting there with their hands folded, right? And it's just it's not boy nature, right? Boys are, in general, more kinetic. I'm not saying that girls are not movement-oriented and kinetic, but let's face it, there are differences. And if we judge those differences, we're not actually helping, boys transform that. And so, like, boys are super vulnerable. I mean, there's early childhood research. The little boys are like, get hurt. They start crying, even cry more than little girls in general. But we give them these messages that you're actually not like that, and actually to be that way is somehow to be unmasculine. So they start learning, the boy box, the boy code, that turns into the man box, the man code, and that's just the way I am. And it's just ignorant and unfortunate. And so part of my own personal mission, and I think our mission, is to really kind of delve into and to some degree explicate really the nature of being human. And we as boys and girls and gender fluid people, are way, way more similar than different. But that doesn't mean there aren't any differences.
Yes.
Right? And to honor the differences and to have really more compassion even for little boys. Because the reality is that when you're treated with compassion, you will generally treat others more compassionately. I mean, it's not a one-to-one correlation, but it's pretty close to that. If you're treated with a lack of compassion, guess what? Your brain forms around not being compassionate. And if compassion is associated, again, with being weak on some level, you're just not going to do it. And so part of what we're trying to do is really to expand the whole nature and notion of being human, and that as guys, really, and as women, and gender fluid, that we kind of the full range of being human, that there's not something called assertiveness that is masculine.
Yes.
It's not nurturing that is feminine. I'm so against these things being called masculine and feminine. Like, that's a crazy lens to see life through. And somehow it's an invisible lens, and that's part of the challenge. We can't see it. And if we can't see it, we can't address it. And I can tell you that as someone who's been pressing into the relationship between certain masculinity beliefs, even in relation to climate, guns and violence, mental and physical health, economics, family values, parenting, early childhood education. I mean, wherever you look, the theme of masculine beliefs is there, but it's invisible, right? And so if we don't start really addressing the challenges that certain aspects of these beliefs have on a multitude of different factors, we're going to keep heading down the road we're heading.
And doing it together, right? And doing it in a way. So I'm just going to try and throw this into every conversation I have about gender, not a zero-sum game, right? To stop playing the polarizing game, to stop playing the zero-sum game, to stop playing, it's another one of those invisible things that we're steeped in, right? That if someone else is gaining, I am losing.
Exactly. You are singing to my inner chorus there. That's actually one of my most pressing beliefs. Is that it's just this craziness of binary thinking. Like if we're helping boys and men, we're hurting girls and women, or we're hurting gender fluid people. Like that is such an idiotic belief. Now it doesn't mean that if we're helping boys and men, that we're not helping girls and women. We're not helping. We need to lift ourselves up, all of us. And this binary thinking is part of this internal operating system that is so invisible that we don't see it. So I'm going to keep a little animated here because I even see it, in my profession, even people who are gender researchers and things like kind of binary thinking. I go, hello, that's not working. Have to expand to include, not to contract to exclude.
I see hope. I see some hope in this, in things like the initiative that I'm going to have you talk about, the event that's coming up that you're going to be conducting, and the Global Compassion Project, and also in things like Richard Reeves' book of Boys and Men that I'm hearing talk about a lot, and some of the other books that are coming out right now, which are from researchers and from statisticians and from docs and from folks who are really looking at this, where they're saying, yeah, it's easy to go into statistics and start to make binaries out of things, but let's stop ourselves from doing that. Let's stop ourselves from, trying to put a linear arc onto something that is scattered and rich and all about averages, right? Like all of the differences between boys and girls, between men and women, are on the averages. Like I can be more similar to a woman than I am to a man, and on the averages there are differences. Yeah,
right, exactly. I definitely feel more classically feminine, and I don't even like to say it that way because I'm my profession, some of my relations, my orientation, and at the same time I feel very guy-ish, whatever that means. I don't feel, I don't know what a woman feels like. I don't know because I'm not in a woman's body. And I think that there takes a certain kind of arrogance to think that one knows, what it's like. When you hear a white person say to a black guy, say, I know what it must be like. No, you don't. You don't know what it must be like. You can attempt to, and you can be open, and you can be curious about, but you don't know what it's like. You really don't. We all have
which comes back to that idea of compassion, that even if I can't understand what it's like to actually stand in your shoes, I can want for you the things that I want for myself and for all, let's go Buddhist, right? For all sentient beings, may all beings kind of language. So talk a little bit about the Global Compassion Coalition, which I know that you've been connected with Rick Hanson and the Global Compassion Coalition for some time, and then the Men and Boys Compassion Initiative.
Yeah. Well, the Global Compassion Coalition was started by Rick Hanson, who, full disclosure, is one of my very best friends, and we've known each other for many decades. And for those of you who don't know Rick, he's written Hardwiring Happiness, Buddha's Brain, resilient, neurodharma. He's a neuropsychologist with a deep, primarily Buddhist practice, and a great human being. So I will say that, knowing him on the inside, he's amazing. And in all of his worldly success, he's also been really focused on how do we make a difference in humanity? How do we help humanity evolve rather than devolve, essentially, and recognizing that compassion is really at the core of it. And so he had this vision, and he's really been working on it for a couple of years now, and he's brought in some really first-class people into the board and and into the involvement. But how do we spread compassion in all different areas of life, from early childhood education, parenting, to leadership, to economics, you name it. How do we inspire and elevate compassion as a core lens to experience life through? Right? Because it's not always there. We can, obviously, for sure. And so it's a much longer story, but I was working with a group in the American Psychological Association for my division about really looking at how do we elevate certain aspects of our perceptions of masculinity into larger world events. And again, I wound up bringing this group over, to the Global Compassion Coalition, which is where we're housed primarily, as well as our division, to look at how do we, on some level, elevate compassion as a core aspect for boys and men. Compassion for boys and men, because there tends to be a dearth of that compassion from boys and men toward others, including themselves. And so it's multi-level, multilinear, multidimensional. And I really believe that as we really spread the nature of compassion, we're able to really create better relationships and essentially, kind of calm down the threat defense system. Because essentially, as human animals, we're humanimals, as I like to call us. We're oriented first toward friend or foe, opportunity or threat, and we tend to pay much more attention to threat. We're far more likely to mistake a stick for a snake than a snake for a stick, because for obvious reasons, it's survival. You make a blunder, and you win a Darwin Award, right? You can take yourself out of life by making a stupid mistake, right? And so we'll tend to bias toward a certain kind of protective way of orienting, because essentially we're vulnerable to a dumb move. And so being self-protective, being defended, makes perfect sense. I don't think it's useful at all judging people's defenses, including our own. They do make sense. And at the same time, I really believe that we have to keep opening those defenses. And is there really a threat here? Because the way the brain is formed, there's implicit systems that live completely outside of awareness and are oriented toward kind of threats, even though the person may not think, for example, that they feel threatened. So a lot of guys are feeling threatened most of the time. But if you ask a guy like, "Hey, are you scared?" "Me? Scared? Talking to me? You serious?" But fear always involves some level of awareness about feeling threatened, right? And so when there's not that awareness there, you're just acting unconsciously through threat and defending yourself. And so I think that when we look at compassion, it actually has to be, you have to have an awareness actually that you feel threatened, and suffering is a form of threat. And then you have the genuine desire to help alleviate that. And the more you can actually direct that towards yourself, like, hey, I feel threatened here. I'm going to give a talk. I'm going to have even lunch with a friend. I shouldn't feel threatened in any way. I should feel, but you feel some anxiety. That's what anxiety is. I mean, anxiety is a threat that's directly connected to survival. And so people go to a party even can feel some level of anxiety, and then they judge themselves. Like, well, it's just a party, but possibility of social exclusion, It's always there. Exclusion relates to a threat to survival, because if you get kicked out of the tribe, that's a death sentence. And so understanding some of these psychodynamics is really useful, and it's very confusing to people because we don't get educated in really how the brain works and how evolution works and how we're organized as humanimals. And so we're constantly in this like weirdness around, oh my God, I feel this and I shouldn't be feeling that, and I'm not masculine because of this, I'm not talking to anyone about that, and so we live in this kind of like bubbles here where other people are bubbled out there, and these bubbles are bubbling around here, but we're not opening up to this larger bubble, and that's what I think like the Mankind Project does, and I've been leading men's groups for close to 4 decades, at this point, and I think that the more that we create a deeper sense of intimacy, of intimacy, and to see like, oh, you too?
Yes.
Like I've been kind of joking around about, kind of semi-seriously about, hey, we need to start a you too movement, not to usurp anything about me too, at all. And that's part of it. Again, there's the binary, thinking like, oh, if you're taking it away from us because you're doing, no, stop that. The you too movement to me would be guys. You're like, you too have vulnerabilities? You too want to love more? You too want to be more open? You too feel anxious about certain things? You too?
Yeah.
Right?
And I mean, and in that same spectrum and in that same way, there's also an accountability. You too have fucked up. You too have made mistakes. You too have acted in ways that were harmful to yourself, to others, to women, to, in that same way, I am responsible, right? We can do that. So what I want to get out of, so there's the evolutionary psychology thing, mistaking a stick for a snake or mistaking a snake for a stick, right? So I love just setting that all aside to come to fast forward. We have negative orientation in our perspective because all of us have experienced some form of trauma in our early childhood that taught us that the world is a dangerous and unsafe place. And at the same time, especially as men and boys, taught us never to reveal or admit that to ourselves or to others, that we were hurt.
Right. Yeah. What could go wrong with that, right?
We have all experienced hurt. So when you're talking about the bubbles bubbling around, it's like the first thing is just like, pop. I've experienced that too. And let's all stop pretending, that we haven't experienced that pain, And compassion is an active vulnerability. I have to be aware of my own vulnerability in order to experience the kind of care that comes with an act of compassion.
Yes.
Thank you. Talk about the event that you've got coming up on the 16th. And I will also say, to out myself, that I'm also connected with and have been participating as like an unbelievably honored fly on the wall for the Compassion Initiative, participant and fly on the wall, for the Compassion Initiative.
You're at least a B.
Thank you. I'll take it. Talk about the event that's coming up later in June.
Yeah. So June 14th, from noon to 1:30 Eastern time, we're having a panel. I'm going to be moderating the panel. And it's our first public-facing panel. We've had a couple panels that have been more invitation only, just kind of prepping for our larger world excursions here. And this is the first one that's going to be more public-facing. So there are 4 panels. Actually, there's one panel and there's 4 different presentations. One of them will be by Paul Gilbert, who's an eminent evolutionary psychologist, and he's created compassion-focused therapy, the Compassionate Mind Institute. Great guy. I've gotten to know him, in the process of this. And he's going to give a kind of a larger overview about the relationship between the 3 C's, as it were. Compassion, which is what obviously we're going to accent. But then there's callousness, which is basically oftentimes through ignorance. We're not aware of others' suffering. We may not have malevolence or malfeasance, but we're not particularly paying attention. We're just inured to it. And then there's cruelty, and obviously that's a whole other animal, of the seas. And he's going to really be explicating these different areas, I think, in a brilliant way that he does. One of the panels will be by two women, who are both female psychologists and recognize that there are ways that some women's attitudes toward boys and men are not, shall we say, compassionate. And they're going to be talking about that and how women can be more allies, really, for boys and men. And then we're going to have one panel will be about fathering, and about how sometimes fathers are kind of shunted to the side, like you literally hear guys when they're talking to the physician or anyone around the child, that they look directly at the mother, and they don't even look, at the father. And so it's interesting about how, dare I say the word privilege, shows up, because certainly guys are always seen as privileged, but, privilege is contextual. You can have privilege in certain areas, but not privilege. If you really want to talk about intersectionality, you can have not privileged, and sometimes fathers are not terribly privileged, in here. And again, this is not an indictment. This is part of the challenge. This is what we want to elevate awareness about the different situations that are really happening, not just some philosophy or some reactive tendencies, but what's really happening. And then there's going to be one about early childhood education, with boys, what happens in schools. We have a task force in our division in boys in school, and it's really been deeply researched about some of the challenges that boys are facing that really Richard Reeves, is speaking about, in his book, and Warren Farrell has spoken about, in The Boy Fight, that there are real challenges that are going on. So we're really going to be looking at kind of naming the challenge, but also really looking at what are the opportunities, in here. What can we do? So we're all about being proactive. And so our work is really around how do we kind of start interacting with and interfacing with different organizations. And we've invited a number of them to participate so that we really make compassion a major motif, in terms of how we orient in the world. And so this panel will be, naming some of the territory. Obviously, It won't be everything. It's 90 minutes. Really invite any of you who are listening to this part to participate. It is the beginning of a long experience of doing this work. We're going to be having a Men, Boys, and Compassion conference in the fall. It's to be announced about when that'll be, probably sometime later, October. But we're going to be doing a lot of public events, and we welcome people to be involved. I mean, we're looking at, this is going to be a village, at least, maybe a large village to really take this on. And it hits me in a very deeply personal and emotional way. This work, this is not conceptual to me. There are concepts for sure, but I live with my own suffering about the state of the world, and just the sadness around how we've been living to some degree on this planet. Not totally, but I really want to be spending my life kind of breathing into how do we spread compassion from and toward boys and men. So that the panel will be, an expression of that, and we definitely invite you to come in and listen in.
Thank you. That is it. So more information that I plugged into the chat that's associated with the video here on Facebook. Daniel Ellenberg, thank you for hanging out with me for a little while. I look forward to being at the panel and contributing. And for those of you on our Facebook page, Mankind Project is part of this move toward compassion for ourselves and compassion for others, for all of us. So thanks for being here.
Thank you, Boyce, and always appreciate your compassion.
Yes, friend.
This has been the Mankind Podcast, produced in association with the Mankind Project USA. I have been your host, Brandon Clift, and I personally want to thank our guests for joining us today and imparting their wisdom from their experiences in this amazing journey called life. Now, the fee for this episode is simple. If you found gold and insights that you believe could benefit your loved ones and those you care about, be sure to share it with them. And of course, remember that life doesn't happen to us, it happens for us, so long as we rip the pen out of fate's hand and become the author of our own story. So my friend, pick up the pen and we'll see you next week. Lots of love.